What are trauma responses? So trauma responses are the body's instinctual response to danger. So it's our unconscious attempt to seek safety, to maintain connection. It's an unconscious way that we cope with a threat. So they are not these conscious strategies that we're choosing. They are the body's way of doing whatever it thinks it needs to do in the moment in order to stay safe. So these trauma responses are broadly broken down into what we sometimes call the 4 F's: fight, flight, freeze, and fawn. Trauma responses are not a bad thing. I think that they can sort of seem like, oh, I'm engaging in this trauma response and it has me in its grips and it sounds like it's a negative thing. But trauma responses are actually there to save our lives. So trauma responses are natural. They're a healthy, natural response to danger. They can have this sort of healthy, adaptive expression that they sort of get you through the thing, you're on the other side, and you can regulate and feel present and back in your life again. But sometimes what happens, particularly with complex trauma, with pervasive experiences of trauma, our trauma response can become fixed. We're in a perpetual state of coping. And what we're doing is we're living in this more maladaptive trauma response, and we don't even know it because it has become so repetitive that we just feel like it's our personality. We feel like this is just who I am. We don't know who we are without the trauma response. So let's talk about these 4 trauma responses and unpack them a little bit, what the sort of adaptive version of the trauma response is and what it can look like when it's in more of this fixed expression. My name is Dr. Ingrid Clayton. I'm a clinical psychologist, a trauma therapist, and a trauma survivor. And today we're talking about trauma responses. So the first trauma response is the fight response. So the fight response can look like having a voice, being able to engage in healthy conflict. It can be assertiveness. It can be about expressing healthy boundaries. It's a willingness to engage on our own behalf. And that would be a healthy expression of the fight response. But when it goes to the maladaptive or more fixed side, that's when we see things like bullying. So when we see those types of repeated patterns, that can be an example of a fixed fight trauma response. Flight trauma response, I think, is one that often people think of when they think of trauma responses. When you think about an animal in the wild, I think I've mentioned this in other videos, and they're constantly sort of very in touch with the environment, surveying the land. They can sense, hear and sense when there's some movement, and they sense some danger, they flee. That is an aspect of the flight response, and you can see very adaptive, right? There's danger, I'm out of here. So it's a literal fleeing of the situation. It can also look like staying in perpetual motion. There's you can't catch me, And so what that can look like on sort of a adaptive side is there's a great efficiency, right? So there's a reason some people say, like, Ingrid, you have complex trauma. How have you done all of the things that you have done, including degrees and writing books and all of these things? Well, in part, I'm aware that it was a flight trauma response. If I go, I'm finally going to get to a place where I feel safe. The problem is, the safety never comes in the sense of arriving. There is no arrival. The safety is in the fleeing, in the perpetual motion. So you kind of have to keep going. And for me, I've had to find a new sense of safety in slowing down, in being present, into not running, even when it looks like running that is achievement-based. That is an aspect of the flight response. So there is this, sense of safety and efficiency that can happen on the adaptive side. But on the maladaptive side, it can lead to chronic perfectionism. I also relate to this one, to obsessive compulsive tendencies like addiction. I relate to this one. There's an overdoing, right? And so this is one area where I could really see, well, like, yeah, this was just my personality, right? This is just who I am. In part it might be, but in part I'm aware that it is my threat response, searching, seeking, hoping for a place to land and finally feel as though I've arrived. So in terms of having a voice and advocating for myself when it comes to complex trauma in particular, I did tend towards the fight response initially. I advocated for myself. I wrote research papers in 8th grade about alcoholism, the family disease. I had a voice. I was sharing things with my teachers, with counselors at school. I eventually, with the help of a school counselor, even organized an intervention with social services, right? That was this aspect of the fight response. I know this is wrong. Something needs to happen. I kind of stepped into the ring looking for a solution. And then I didn't find one. In fact, things really got worse. This was the part in my story where I was told that didn't happen, so you're a liar. And if some of that stuff happened, it's not that big of a deal. You're just selfish and sensitive. And so in a lot of ways, my fight response, my original go-to, it was like, that didn't work. So the body is taking notes and it's like, okay, got it. Do not advocate for yourself. Do not be loud. You need to find another way. And that was when I started to kind of pivot into some of these other trauma responses that I will speak about here now. Okay, then there's the freeze response. So this is the response that we often think of in terms of dissociation. There's a numbing that can happen. It's like a hiding, a numbing, a shrinking. It ranges from the adaptive side to being able to rest and sort of find peace. There's like a going inward. But in the maladaptive side of things, it can lead to total avoidance, really being checked out into complete isolation, and even major depression, right? So you can see how that would be problematic over time. But it's very common for particularly childhood trauma survivors to have the freeze response that really involves dissociation. Their environment was so not safe that they literally had to leave their bodies in order to survive it. And it's also why many childhood trauma survivors don't have specific memories about what happened, because they were in fact not in their body in order to encode those memories while it was happening. So we often look more towards what your symptoms are now than to a specific event to determine the impact that trauma has had on someone. Lastly is a term that Pete Walker, he's a psychotherapist who specializes in complex trauma. He coined the term fawning. So the fawning trauma response is basically people-pleasing. I really see it as the heartbeat of codependency. It's really abandoning yourself in service of others in the hope that if I prioritize them and I take care of them, they're gonna, circle back and take care of me. But ultimately, that act of service ends up being about not just abandoning yourself, but your vulnerability and your feelings. There's just a real disregard of who you are and what you need and what you're going through. So it can range from, in a healthy sense, being helpful. If it looks altruistic, there's a service aspect that can be very lovely. But on the maladaptive side, this is the real chronic codependency. So there's like no self, because it's all about showing up for others. It can really actually look like servitude. The fawning response often comes when the other trauma responses have not been effective. So I sort of call it the last house on the block relationally. And it kind of makes sense, right? The fawning trauma response can be a very common response for people that grew up in abusive family systems, dysfunctional toxic, addicted family systems. Often, if there's a narcissistic family system, it's a very common coping strategy. And all of these can be in combination. It's not like you have one trauma response and that's always your go-to. In fact, many people sort of have a hybrid, or they tend towards this one or that one. I'm an equal opportunity trauma response person, although I would say that over time, the main ones that I notice in myself are the fawning and the flight response. So in general, if you look at fight, flight, freeze, and fawn, you can also see that they tend to go towards extremes. And so what I've noticed is that part of coming out of the fawn response, the unhealthy expression of the fawn response, has meant coming back towards my original fight response, right? Because in a fawn response, I don't matter. I don't have a voice. I don't get to be seen. And so moving more towards present tense, I get to be here, I get to have a voice, I matter, has meant coming back into what feels like a fight response. So much so that it can feel as though I'm being mean, like I'm being mean just to be who I am and to assert myself and to have a voice, to have healthy boundaries. Healthy boundaries can feel mean if you have not had healthy boundaries your whole life because you felt like it wasn't safe in order to do so. You didn't have any modeling about what healthy boundaries looked like. So ideally, and there's no perfect here, but coming out of fawn moves a little bit more towards this end of the fight response, where it's okay to engage in conflict. It's okay to have a difference of opinion. It's okay to have a healthy boundary. And then the same is true with the freeze and the flight response. So if I'm that person who stays in perpetual motion in the flight response, the perfectionism, the overdoer, I'm gonna get there, part of slowing down and moving more towards a freeze, that sort of rest and peace, is a part of my work. And so you can look at where you are. I think Pete Walker does an amazing job of exploring the trauma responses on his website, and lots of other people have many resources. I have talked about what these look like for me and what it has meant to identify them and move through them. I give a lot of examples in my memoir, Believing Me, Healing from Narcissistic Abuse and Complex Trauma. But in essence, I think even just having this framework, okay, it's like, oh, right, these are about survival. The body's primary concern is survival. It's not looking for our opinion. It's not about how do you feel about this thing? It's not conscious. It's saying, I'm going to do whatever I need to do to feel safe in the moment, which is so genius. I'm so grateful that there's that wisdom in our bodies. It just becomes a little problematic when that safety over time becomes rigid. It becomes fixed. And in that way, we are able to go, okay, I'm going to come into present time and really assess, am I still in danger? Do I really need to engage in the way that my body wants me to? Can I notice it? Can I look around and get curious about how much I'm really needing to do that? Can I take chances where it feels possible to take chances, to maybe consciously try and do things a little bit differently, to build a new sense of safety relationally within ourselves and with safe people that we can choose in our lives now that we may not have been able to choose, these particularly childhood relationships. You're thrown into this environment, you're thrown into coping, and then suddenly that's like your blueprint for the rest of your life. Thank goodness we know it doesn't have to be that way. We actually do have more choice, but it takes some efforting to look at, okay, what am I doing? Why am I doing it? Do I need to be? Am I willing to just move the needle a tiny little bit? I'll be doing additional videos on each of the trauma responses, so go ahead and subscribe if you haven't already so you can tune back in and get more information. Thanks for being here. Talk to you soon.